So you think you're possessed? You can't stop tapping your foot to the music in your head. Well, you'd best count yourself lucky. At least you still have your will. The rest of them didn't. They lost it to the music, to the rhythm that drove them till their bones broke and their hearts burst. Oh yes, there's a cure worse than madness, worse than plague or famine. It's worse than losing your home or your kin. It is the loss of self, the surrender of soul. Can you imagine anything worse? Of course you can. You read the papers every day. You hear the news. You watch the news. You see how people willingly give up their wills, their minds, their very selves to follow a tune played by a madman with a broken violin. Well, that's exactly what happened in Strasbourg. Only it wasn't a madman playing the tune, nor was it a single tune. There were many tunes. It was the tune in their heads that drove them. Why? No one knew. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the hunger. Maybe it was God. Or maybe it was the devil. All we know is that something made them dance. Something made them dance till they died. Do you feel it too? The beat inside your skull? Don't deny it. You do. We all do. It's why we tap our feet, why we sway to the music, why we lose ourselves in the present moment. Because there is power in rhythm, power in repetition, power in letting go. Have you ever let go completely? Have you ever danced till you couldn't breathe? Have you ever swayed to the music in your head even when no one was watching? Come on, be honest. Are you sure you haven't surrendered your will to a nameless tune? Are you sure you won't? After all, it's only a step away. A single step, then two, then three. And soon you'll be dancing, dancing, dancing. And then you'll be free. Free of everything. Free of self, free of sin. You'll be free if you dance. Just dance. Oh please, please dance. It's the only way to be free. What do you do when no one can explain what is happening? When the shaking, the twitching, the uncontrollable urge to dance, to spin, to leap, takes hold of your body, and you don't know why? No one in Strasbourg knew. It began subtly as skittering in the blood, a restlessness of the limbs, a compelling rhythm just beneath the skin. Physicians insisted that it was a sickness of the blood, a natural response to heat, stress, and poor diet. They pointed to texts from antiquity, descriptions of hysteria, of melancholia turned kinetic, but their remedies did nothing. Herbs and bleeding failed. Prayers brought no calm. Those afflicted by the dancing remained caught in an invisible current that pulled them deeper into exhaustion, and for many into death. The clergy, torn between faith and terror, shifted their approach. Some denounced the afflicted as sinners, accusing them of weakness, heresy, or demonic indulgence. Others offered compassion and shelter, only to find their chapels filled with twitching bodies. relics were brought in from distant abbeys, carried through streets that reeked of sweat and incense. Monks knelt in the dirt to pray, their voices trembling as dancers spun past them, eyes wide and empty. The rituals offered no peace. The relics grew cold. The prayers fell flat. Outside Strasbourg, rumors began to spread. Word traveled along rivers and trade roads. Tales of a cursed city, of people moving without will or rest. Travelers avoided the gates. Pilgrims steered their feet elsewhere. Even nearby villages sent word to their churches, asking if such a fate could befall them. 2. Was it a punishment for pride? For indulgence? For forgotten vows? Among the people, explanations sprouted like weeds. Some said it was the devil, testing their faith. Others spoke of witches, of charms, buried beneath the city. A few whispered of something older, forces predating Christ, bound to the land itself. They told stories of spirits that once danced in forests, of rites performed in secret clearings, of blood spilled to appease things no longer named. Perhaps, they said, Strasbourg had built its churches atop sacred ground, and now the ground had woken. As the summer wore on, the dancers grew more desperate. They no longer resembled people. Their skin, pale and stretched thin, hung loosely from limbs that jerked with a rhythm that had turned violent. Their eyes were glassy. Some screamed without end. Others laughed until their voices broke. A few sang strange melodies, lullabies twisted into something dissonant. Mothers danced away from their children. Sons collapsed in front of their fathers. No one was spared. Efforts to contain the phenomenon failed. The square could no longer hold them all. Streets became rivers of motion. Windows rattled from the footfalls. At night, the city did not sleep. The beat of dancing echoed through walls, seeping into dreams. The healthy began to tremble. Some sealed their homes with ash and prayer. Others fled. The council, once confident in their authority, began to unravel. They spoke less in meetings. Their scrolls and reports grew erratic, filled with scribbles and marginalia. One scribe, it was said, copied a list of names and added his own, then stood and danced until his legs gave out. Another broke into the cathedral and danced down the center aisle beneath stained glass saints. The councillors watched from windows and wept. Leadership had become meaningless. Somewhere deep in the city, Frau Trophia disappeared. No one knows what became of her. Some say she died, bones broken, breathless. Others claim she wandered into the woods, dancing still. A few insisted she never existed at all, that she was a specter, a symbol, a spirit called forth by the collective madness of a people frayed to the edge. Whatever the truth, her name faded, swallowed by the larger story. There was talk of exodus. Entire families gathered what they could and fled. But many stayed, not from courage, but from fatigue. Where would they go? Who would take them? And how far could they run from something that lived in the air, the soil, the soul? By August, a pattern emerged. Every few days the fever seemed to ebb. The dancers slowed. Their bodies sagged. Some collapsed and never rose. Others crawled into alleys and wept. But then, as if cued by some unseen conductor, the frenzy would begin again. A soundless music pulsing beneath the city, a hum felt in the bones. No one played, no one sang. But the rhythm returned, always. And so Strasbourg waited, not for salvation, not for answers, but for the next step, the next fall, the next face to turn blank and begin to move. This is an excerpt from my novel. I wrote this because I wanted to show how the plague affected not just the minds of the characters, but also the very structure of their reality. How do you show that? Well, by making the city itself sick. The buildings are fine, but everything in them, everything around them, even the wind, is tainted. Reality has been cracked. It's still there, but the order is gone. Nothing is normal. I looked at how plague outbreaks affected daily life in Europe in the 14th century. People kept diaries, took notes, even made drawings of what they saw. So I used those sources to inform what I wrote. I wanted to make the reader feel like a fly on the wall, observing but also affected by the atmosphere. The story follows the plague's progression from initial cases to total havoc. We see the city authorities first try reason, then turn to religion, and finally succumb to the chaos. Throughout, we experience the sickness through the senses, the sight of disturbing postures, the sound of odd cadences, the smell of sweat and blood. These details build a picture of a city transformed into something grotesque and alien. The use of dance as a motif is crucial. Dancing can express joy, but here it becomes a darker, sinister thing, a compulsion that drives the afflicted to ruin. This is not dancing, it's something darker, a seizure of motion, a force that takes the body as its instrument and plays it into ruin. The motif of sight versus blindness is also important. Those who watch may be tempted to join the dancers, to become like them. Sight here is both a curse and a blessing, granting knowledge, but also torment. The more one observes, the greater the risk. So some characters choose to cover their eyes or fill their ears, trying to shut out the plague's sensory assault. The breakdown of social order is another key theme. The plague doesn't just affect individuals, it tears apart the fabric of society. As the afflicted increase, the city descends into chaos. Shops are abandoned, bells are muffled, streets become dangerous. The plague triumphs over light, music, even speech. It's a terrifying prospect, a world where nothing is safe, where even the most basic acts of life become fraught with peril. My goal with this piece was to evoke a sense of mounting dread and helplessness. The plague is inescapable, relentless, and ultimately victorious. The characters can't fight it, reason with it, or outrun it. All they can do is succumb or resist, and neither option offers much hope. That bleakness is part of the story's power, but it's not the whole story. Even in the face of such overwhelming darkness, there's a strange beauty in the writing. A kind of grim lyricism that makes this nightmare world strangely compelling. That's the end of the excerpt. Let me know what you think. As the affliction grew, so too did the city's silence. Strasbourg, once filled with the ordinary sounds of carts rolling over stone, of voices haggling in the square, of children laughing and bells ringing to mark the hours, was now eerily quiet. The noise that remained was unnatural. It was the shuffling of tired feet, the slap of flesh on cobblestone, the strained moans of exhausted dancers. Even the crows that circled above had gone quiet, as if unwilling to caw over a city slowly slipping into madness. Inside their homes, people whispered. They spoke in hushed tones behind locked shutters, sharing rumors like contraband. Some believed the dancing plague was a punishment not from God, but from the land itself. That the soil had become angry, that ancient pacts had been broken. Others insisted that the dancers were possessed not metaphorically, but truly, that their bodies had become vessels for something nameless, something that moved from person to person, like a wind in the corridors of the soul. And others still said nothing. They watched from windows, their eyes sunken, their thoughts caught in places they dared not speak of. For even among the uninfected, the city's fever had begun to spread, not in steps or spasms, but in thought, in dreams. In the heavy pressure that built behind the eyes and in the legs. When one stood too long near the afflicted, more than one person had reportedly started to hum melodies they did not know, or twitch in sleep. One woman awoke to find herself standing in the garden, barefoot, her dress soaked in dew, her feet black with dirt. She had no memory of rising from her bed. The dancers moved through the streets like ghosts, sometimes alone, sometimes in clusters. Their numbers rose and fell unpredictably. Some fell to the ground and were mistaken for dead, only to stir and begin again. Others vanished entirely. The city sent search parties into the woods and along the rivers. Some were found, others were not. Then came the mimicry. Children began to imitate the dancers during play. They spun and staggered in games, laughing at first until one of them didn't stop. He kept spinning, his laughter turning into breathless gasps, his arms flailing wildly. He danced until he fell, and though his mother cradled him, he did not rise. The children were forbidden from playing such games again, but the fear had taken root. What if the movement itself was contagious? What if copying the afflicted Evan in jest was enough to invite the plague into the body? A midwife swore that the affliction came through the eyes, that to look too long upon a dancer was to feel a flicker of that same fire ignite within oneself. She began wearing a veil, treating patients by touch alone. A blacksmith poured wax into his ears, fearing that there was a melody the rest of the world could not hear. He kept to his forge for weeks, hammering rhythmically, refusing to speak. When he finally emerged, his hands were burned and his eyes darted in every direction. The city's leadership, already fractured, began to fall apart completely. Some council members resigned their positions and fled. Others stayed, issuing desperate proclamations. Music was banned again. Musicians were arrested, their instruments broken in the square. Public gatherings were forbidden. Curfews were imposed, though few obeyed them. Those who enforced the rules did so half-heartedly, fearful that any sudden movement might spark the wrong kind of attention. There were whispers of hidden gatherings, of people dancing in secret deliberately, ritually, attempting to join the madness before it chose them. These underground rituals varied. Some were solemn, performed in silence, lit only by candlelight. Others were wild, with painted faces and rhythmic chanting. They believed that surrendering to the rhythm on their own terms could somehow inoculate them, could appease whatever dark thing had taken root. It did not. Some who danced returned home and never stirred again. Others did not return at all. And the city, its soul frayed beyond repair, waited for winter, for the frost, for silence, for anything that might break the fever that had turned their lives into a dream they could not wake from. But the rhythm continued, not always loud. Sometimes it was a whisper, sometimes it was just the ticking of the mind, but it was always there, like breath, like hunger, like something waiting. Have you ever heard of the dancing plague? Of course you have. It's everywhere. It's in our music, our movies, our art. Take a look around you. You can see it in the twitch of an eyelid, the tap of a foot, the beat of a heart. We are all dancers. We all dance to the rhythm of life. But have you ever heard of the plague that took 16th century, a sickness that drove people to dance uncontrollably until they dropped dead of exhaustion? Well, here goes. In the summer of 1518, the people of Alsace began to dance in the streets. At first it was just a handful of women. Then more and more people joined them. Soon entire villages were dancing. At first, it seemed like a joyful celebration. People sang and drank and laughed as they moved through the streets, but as the weeks went on, the dancing became more frantic. The people moved faster and faster until they were shaking with exhaustion. Their eyes rolled back in their heads. Their limbs contorted at unnatural angles. Some bit off their own tongues. Others ripped at their chests. A few screamed in languages that hadn't been spoken in centuries, or perhaps were never spoken at all. One witness described a woman who danced with such violence that her shoes wore away entirely. Still, she moved on, her bare feet slapping the stone, the flesh torn and blood pooling behind her with every step. She smiled through tears, her face twisted in a joyless grin, murmuring over and over, "He calls, he calls, he calls." The physician who recorded this watched her collapse and die an hour later. He closed his book that evening and never opened it again. And still, the phenomenon defied explanation. Some began to ask darker questions. What if this was not a plague of the body, but of the world itself? What if the earth groaning, under war, poverty, cruelty, had begun to shake us loose like fleas from a beast's back? What if the rhythm was not a disease, but a signal, a message? And what if those who danced were not cursed, but chosen? Among the clergy, a quiet heresy began to grow. A monk from the southern quarter began to preach in secret that the afflicted were hearing the voice of God, and that the rhythm was divine, that through their bodies, something holy was being spoken. He gathered followers, held midnight masses, where dancers were welcomed, embraced, even exalted. They were no longer sick. He said they were sacred. The church responded swiftly. The monk was arrested, then vanished. His chapel was sealed. His followers were scattered. But the idea lingered like smoke, curling into the hearts of those desperate for meaning, because still, the dancers danced. By early autumn, the number of active cases began to wane. Whether due to death, collapse, or the mercy of time, no one could say, but something had shifted. The streets were no longer filled with movement. The rhythm remained, but it had gone underground, quieter, dormant, watching, and those who had survived, those whose bodies had finally ceased to move, were not unchanged. They were quieter, yes, but also distant. They stared too long at empty spaces. They flinched at sudden sounds. Some wept when they heard music. Others tore at their ears, unable to bear the sound of footsteps or birdsong. They had been emptied, scraped out by something no one could name. A few spoke of what they'd experienced. One man said he had seen a great darkness beneath the ground, pulsing like a heartbeat, sending out waves that moved through the stone into his bones. Another claimed he heard music made of whispers and wind and sobbing, layered so deep it could not be silenced. A woman described a figure made of ash and cloth, dancing in front of her, always, never turning its face. Many said nothing at all. And so the city rebuilt, slowly. The markets reopened. The churches held services. The bells rang once more to mark the hours. But nothing was as it had been. People moved more cautiously, spoke more softly, laughed more rarely. Even the children played differently no longer, imitating the dancers, but walking carefully, as if afraid of waking something sleeping beneath the streets. The records would survive, barely. In years to come, some would speak of the dancing plague as myth, as exaggeration, as something symbolic rather than literal. But those who had been there never doubted. They remembered the sound of bare feet on stone, the way eyes could empty overnight, the way movement could become a prison. They remembered that Strasbourg had once moved as if possessed. And they remembered that, for a time, the city had lost its will. And though the plague faded from the square, and the music died away, some still listened. Listened for the rhythm. Listened for the next step. Listened for the moment when silence would break, and the dance would begin again. A small alley near the fish market. 4 dancers had died within minutes of one another, their bodies falling into grotesque piles. A ruined cellar beneath a bakeress shop where a group of afflicted had sheltered themselves and danced in total darkness for days until only 2 emerged, shivering and mute. A corner of the cathedral courtyard where wax had melted into the stones from so many candles, their flames flickering as if in time with something unsung. People walked different paths, closed shutters earlier, left coins at corners without explanation. There were rules now. Unwritten but followed. One simply did not whistle in the street or tap one's foot near others or mention music, unless necessary. Something had shifted. The plague had been a wound, and though it no longer bled, it had not healed. Its presence lingered, like heat after fire or scent after decay, and in some strange way, it had become part of Strasbourg's identity, unspoken, but felt, like a scar across the back of the city, hidden beneath clothes, sensitive to touch. Visitors arrived again eventually. Pilgrims, merchants, scribes. They asked questions, and some were answered, most were not. The locals spoke little of the plague. Those who did so slowly, and always with eyes cast downward. Some offered theories, about the harvest, the heat, the stars. Others pointed to St. Vitus or to demons, unnamed. But none truly explained what had happened. Not fully, because what they had seen, what they had lived through, did not fit into words. It existed in a space between. It was not madness, but it was not sanity, not illness, yet not health, not punishment, and not miracle. It had simply happened. Years passed. The children who had seen it became adults. The dancers who had survived grew older or vanished. The city rebuilt its sense of normalcy, slowly stitching together the routines that hold life in place: prayer, trade, birth, harvest. But something beneath remained loose, a thread, frayed and waiting. And every so often, someone would feel it. Not a full dance, just a step, a twitch in the leg, a rhythm caught while walking alone. They would pause, breathe, blink, and it would pass. Usually, the church, for its part, continued to watch carefully. Every report of unusual movement, every mention of trance or rhythm, was recorded, monitored, quietly questioned. Priests trained in rites older than scripture were dispatched to homes. Holy water was sprinkled more liberally. Relics were rotated between parishes, as if to refresh their power. In secret, a few texts were written, accounts by survivors, testimonies by monks, records by doctors who had dared to stay. These were not widely shared. Some were sealed away in abbeys, others were burned outright. But a handful remained, passed hand to hand among the curious, the scholars, the fearful. In the years that followed, the memory of the plague softened, not disappeared, never that, but dulled at the edges, like a blade left to rust. New generations heard stories. Children asked why certain alleys were avoided, why their grandparents frowned at dancing, why there were no musicians in some districts. And the answers came not in warnings, but in quiet shifts of the voice, in glances exchanged, and phrases that trailed off before the truth could be named. They called it the summer. The city forgot how to stand still. It entered folklore, wrapped in half-truths and symbolism. Some painted it as a divine test, others as a lesson in restraint. A few interpreted it as a metaphor for grief, or guilt, or collective sorrow. But those who had been there knew better. They had felt the heat, the pulse beneath the stones, the sense that something ancient had awakened and chosen their city as a stage. A few tried to study it. Scholars, centuries later, they examined records, questioned timelines, mapped the spread. They proposed ergot poisoning, a fungus on bread that caused hallucinations. They suggested mass hysteria, driven by famine and fear. They argued, debated, wrote papers, but none of them had heard it. None of them had been there to feel the quiet dread, the rhythmic tension in the bones, the way a whole population could tremble beneath a silence shaped like a beat. And so the scholars wrote, but the city remembered differently. Some memories stayed unwritten. They were passed through gestures, customs, silences. They appeared in paintings where faces turned slightly too far, in hymns where a single note rang out too long. They lived in the hesitation before a dance began, in the way eyes scanned a room when music played. The city never fully recovered because it never fully understood. How could it? What had happened was not illness, not possession, not punishment. It was something that moved beneath the surface of things, beneath language, beneath logic. A rhythm, older than memory. A beat that, once heard, could never be fully forgotten. And some, even centuries later, claim to hear it still. Centuries passed, and Strasbourg changed. Stone gave way to brick, torches to lanterns, dirt roads to cobbled streets. The bells of the cathedral still rang, but fewer people looked up when they did. The world had grown louder: carriages, machinery, footsteps echoing in the narrow lanes. And yet, in certain corners, silence still ruled. In the shadow of the cathedral, near the river's bend, outside the old square, there were still those who remembered, though not with names or dates, but in feeling. A dancer once visited Strasbourg, modern, vibrant, unaware. She came to perform in a theater near the city center. Her show was elegant, precise, modern, and yet, after the performance, she wandered the streets in the evening, drawn by something she couldn't name. She wrote in her journal that she felt watched, but not by eyes, by something deeper. Like the city is listening, she said, like it's waiting for me to take the wrong step. She never danced again. In old families, traditions lingered, not written ones but behavioral. Daughters forbidden from barefoot movement on stone. Sons warned never to mock illness. Music, sometimes, was banned on certain days without reason. In one household, every child was taught the same phrase before bed: still feet, still breath, still mind. No explanation, just repetition. Anthropologists noticed. Eventually, they wrote about inherited trauma, about cultural echoes, but they missed something vital, something that never left the stones. In Strasbourg, there are no monuments to the plague, no statues, no plaques, no memorials, just the absence of one, as if to name it would be to wake it. Even in archives, references to the summer of 1518 are sparse. There are entries, yes, court records, medical notes, sermons, but few linger on the emotional truth. Fewer still describe what it felt like to hear the beat of your own heart and wonder if it belonged to you anymore. And yet, the dancers remain. In shadows, in pauses, in dreams. One priest in the 1800s recorded a strange confession. A man claimed that he sometimes heard music from beneath his floorboards. Not loud, just a hum, soft, persistent. At first he thought it was wind, then rats, then madness. But the tune remained. He moved house. It followed. Eventually he stopped walking at night, fearing his feet would begin to move without his will. The priest dismissed it, but he never forgot. Even today, there are stories, people who visit Strasbourg and feel a strange tension in the legs, who walk a little too quickly through the old quarter, who hesitate when a street performer begins to play. Some laugh it off, others don't, because deep down, we remember what the city learned. That movement can be a language, that rhythm can be a curse, that history doesn't always sleep quietly beneath our feet. Sometimes, it taps. What happened in Strasbourg was not the first time, and it would not be the last. Historians, digging through brittle parchment and forgotten chronicles, found echoes elsewhere, whispers of towns overtaken by strange movements, of villagers seized by trances, of dances that lasted days or weeks. In Aachen, in Cologne, in Flanders, and in the Alps. Always described differently, always remembered the same. Dancing plagues, they called them. But the word plague is not quite right, because a plague is understood. A plague has a pattern, a vector, a treatment. What happened in Strasbourg had none of these. It had only rhythm, only movement, only memory. And it raised a question that never quite went away. What if this is part of us? Not a sickness, but a possibility. A hidden code, written into our blood and breath, waiting for the right conditions to unfold. What if the dancing was not madness, but instinct, ancient, forgotten, like a language we once spoke before we knew how to write? Something in the body remembered the beat, and when the world grew too heavy, too full, too loud, or too silent, it surfaced. Because the world does not forget. The soil remembers footsteps, the wind remembers breath, stone remembers pain, and perhaps Strasbourg remembers more than most. When the city sleeps, there are places that hum, not with sound, but with weight. Corners where the air is too still, rooms where the shadows bend a little strangely, a silence that isn't empty, but listening. People live their lives above this silence. They marry, work, age, and die. They hear music in cafes, walk past choirs, attend festivals, but deep below it all, the rhythm waits. It doesn't rush. It doesn't call. It doesn't even stir. It simply waits for the moment the city forgets and steps in time once more. This is the place where it began, where the cobblestones cracked, and the foundations shifted, and the very walls seemed to tremble and sigh, under the weight of what had happened here. The dancing plague of 1518, a sickness unlike any other, afflicted this city and many others throughout Europe. For 45 days, people danced in the streets of Strasbourg non-stop, until they dropped from exhaustion or hunger or the delirium brought on by fever. In the end, there were no answers. No monument to mark where the first foot fell, no song to capture the melody that never played. No saint to take credit, no devil to take the blame. Only the silence remained. It rolled over the city like fog, curling through the spaces left behind. Houses were repaired, streets were cleaned. Children were born who would never know what their mothers had seen, but the silence never left. It took residence in the cracks between bricks, in the hollows of bells, in the hush just before a storm. And for those who had danced, those who had moved until their bodies broke, what remained was not memory, but echo. They did not speak of what had happened, not truly, not in full. Some could not, some chose not to. Some forgot entirely, as if whatever had moved them had taken a part of their minds when it left. But they carried it all the same. In their steps, in their stillness, in the way they looked at music, or at shadows, or at their own trembling hands. And the world turned, as it always does. Other wars came, other plagues, other fires and famines. Time gathered everything into its endless arms, and Strasbourg, like every city, became modern, electric, connected, but somewhere beneath the asphalt and concrete, the old stones remain. And the stones remember. They remember the heat, they remember the sweat, they remember the footsteps that would not stop. And maybe, if you walk there quietly, alone, you'll feel it too. A subtle pressure in your spine, a twinge in the heel, a rhythm that doesn't come from your mind, but your marrow. You'll pause, you'll smile, you'll say, it's nothing. And maybe it is, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's the silence, asking if you remember.